The bill is simply wrong and offends against human decency and international law.
It's about using Jews as a pawn in the government's political game.
That those opposing this bill in its entirety today are on the right side of history.
And I think it would be thought to be absolutely astonishing that we are faced with this measure today in the British Parliament.
Is Palestinian activism under threat in the UK? Under a new legislation before the British Parliament, it could become illegal for public bodies to boycott or support a boycott that targets a foreign country. It highlights specifically any movement seeking to cut economic ties with Israel, the occupied Palestinian territories, and the Golan Heights, going further than even the government's own foreign policy position. It's called the Economic Activity of Public Bodies Overseas Matters Bill, but critics have labelled it the Anti-Boycott Bill and say it's intended specifically to target the pro-Palestinian civil rights movement known as BDS, boycott, divestment and sanctions. For more than a decade, BDS has been the primary tool used by Palestinian activists and civil society to pressure Israel's government to abide by international law, inspired by the success of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa. So what happens if this bill passes in the UK? And what will it mean for Palestinian voices and activism in general? Welcome to The Big Picture. My name is Mohammed Hassan, and today we are sitting down with Conservative MP Crispin Blunt. Blunt is a former chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and is currently the director of the International Centre of Justice for Palestinians. Last year, he announced he would be stepping down from his parliamentary seat at the end of his term. Crispin Blunt, thank you very much for being here. Welcome to The Big Picture. The Economic Activity of Public Bodies Overseas Matters Bill, that's what it's been labelled as, but its critics say it's an anti-boycott bill, and specifically an anti-Israeli boycott bill. What is in the provision of this bill, and what does it claim that it's trying to do?
Well, you will note that the title of the bill sounds rather innocuous. And indeed, the bill was published 2 weeks before it was first debated on second reading in the House of Commons. And that's the minimum time a public bill can actually be debated after it's been published. So the whole process within government before that doesn't appear, so far as I understand, to have had proper collective discussion, understanding the implications of the political debate that was going to follow this bill once people actually understood what its terms meant. So this innocuous sounding measure, I don't think got proper attention inside government for the not least the values implications for the Conservative Party of trying to put forward a motion or legislation that has such savage sanctions against those who even presume to speak against the measures once they were enacted, if they are. And I sincerely hope that in the process of the consideration of the bill, Parliament will throw it out. If not in the House of Commons, but certainly in the House of Lords.
And that is one of the major criticisms of the bill, is that there's a lot of weaknesses in it. It is very hashed together, as
there
some
aren't any
people.
strengths in it. I mean, it's an appalling measure. First of all, it identifies on the face of the legislation Israel in the terms that Israel defines its political geography, not in the terms that the world accepts Israel,
Which is Israel, the occupied, West Bank and the Golan Heights.
And so the specific, therefore, protections for the occupied Palestinian territories and the occupied Golan Heights are an affront to a sense of international order, and they are not of a piece with the United Kingdom's stated view of the political geography in the region, and what we recognise as a legitimate control of those areas.
Well, the peculiar thing is that it even goes further than the government's own position with regards to its foreign policy and its treatment of occupied territories in the Golan Heights.
Well, that's exactly the point. So, where was the collective conversation inside government? What were the Foreign Office doing in allowing this bill to come forward without those issues being resolved? And the poor old bill minister simply continued to protest that this has no implications for Britain's foreign policy. I mean, it's straightforward nonsense.
And this is specifically looking at public bodies. This includes councils. Does it include universities?
Yes.
What else does it include?
Well, the definition of public bodies is in law is quite wide. It is, as I understand the meaning of the law in this area, it's anybody which has any kind of public function.
And what are the implications then for, let's say, a student union that wanted to pass a motion in support of a boycott of Israel?
Then it would be in breach of the law and subject to an unlimited fine. And the individuals and indeed the individuals responsible for expressing that view. It's plainly outrageous, and it doesn't actually stand up to the slightest application of any common sense test. Here is a long-standing, bitter conflict that is at the centre of the insecurity in the Middle East, and the United Kingdom appears to be proposing that one of the parties to that conflict, in pursuing tactics of resistance that are entirely peaceful, are entirely legal by any standard, against aggression that we're saying is not proportionate to its objective, that not only are we going to ban public bodies from being associated with those kinds of actions, but we're also going to ban people from speaking in support of those actions. And even worse, we're then going to say to people, there's a double gagging order on this, that you're not even going to be allowed to say, we would have done this had we been allowed to. It is really quite extraordinary that this legislation is being proposed in the British Parliament, and very ironic that it was introduced at second reading on a day when the Jenin refugee camp was under assault from drones at dawn, attacking various targets, and by the time we finished in the evening, there were still helicopter gunships overhead.
For a large number of Palestinian activists, pro-Palestinian activists, certainly Palestinian civil society, they see the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment and sanctions, as the only non-violent way of resisting Israeli occupation. Certainly, they're only tools of putting pressure on the Israeli government overseas. What does a bill like this do to their ability to be able to voice their concerns internationally, but certainly within a country like the UK?
Well, that was the question I posed in the Chamber on my brief speech on second reading. What else do we expect people to do if you take this away? And plainly the implications are, as you are driving people into a course of violence. Now, there is violent resistance that is allowed under the law. It's just a fabulously unproductive route to take, because you write the Israeli narrative about what they're facing for them, and so it's singularly unwise to take that route. But if you leave people with nothing else, what's going to happen? So that's why this measure is profoundly wrong in all senses as well.
Do you think there would be wider implications if this bill passes for activism in general in the UK?
Well, what I hope is that we will see this bill as a point of overreach, where the values associated with what's coming forward in the legislation will then be revealed to be actually truly shocking, thoroughly un-British, and that will enable the debate in the United Kingdom, the debate that's raging inside the Jewish community in the United Kingdom. We obviously have a close association with the state of Israel as the world's only Jewish state. That what's going on is wrong, and it's going to do damage to both to everyone associated with it, whether it's the British government, the State of Israel, or indeed the Jewish community in the UK, who are terribly conflicted over this.
The issue of anti-Semitism has been particularly heightened in the realm of British politics over the last couple of years, certainly with what's been happening with the Labour Party. Is this a bill coming in the spirit of addressing anti-Semitism in British society? Is that the intention behind this bill, or is this something that is, in your eyes, completely separate?
Well, that's the stated purpose of this measure. And I can't think of a measure that's more likely to stir up anti-Semitism than something that is incredibly unfair, stated to address anti-Semitism, and serves to disarm one of the parties to the Middle East conflict of a peaceful means of resistance and encouraging Israel to change. I think it's absolutely vital for the Palestinians that they use the moral and legal authority of their position. Now, there's quite a lot of it because there's 100 years of dispossession and expulsion sitting behind that. Hence, millions of people in refugee camps all over the place, and people crowded into places like Gaza in conditions that are frankly pretty unacceptable, and they remain firmly under occupation as the State of Israel controls the access to those territories. We need to use this as a moment to another opportunity for people to look at actually what's happened. What's happened since the Balfour Declaration? Britain has a particular history and implicit responsibility in these circumstances, and there's every reason why we should be proud of one half of the Balfour Declaration, which, not least in light of what happened in the Holocaust, the Shoah, which was the culmination of centuries of appalling oppression of Jewish people all over Europe, that we finally enabled there to be a homeland where Jews could be safe. There was another half to the Balfour Declaration, which was about the rights of the people who were already there, and that has been so far consigned to the dustbin of history. Well, the reason there is an ongoing conflict is that both halves of that of the Balfour Declaration needed to be delivered if we were to establish a Jewish homeland, which is now a fact of history.
There are people that accuse the British government of holding an implicitly pro-Israel bias in the conflict, but also when it comes to public debate here in the UK. Do you believe this is true?
Yes, and it's clear that the latest agreements between the British government and the government of Israel, whether it's a trade agreement or the roadmap to the future, the enthusiasm for engagement with Israel doesn't appear to be qualified at all in the way that it needs to be about the difficulties that Israel has in reconciling the fact that it is in illegal occupation of someone else's territory, a gross breach of the Fourth Geneva Convention. That land, which was meant to be the basis of global order in the wake of the Second World War. We were meant to be in a place where people were not able to take territory and then settle it with its own people and expel people who were already there. This is a fundamental no-no. Well, Israel has been doing it for 56 years.
There is something called the BDS campaign, which is a campaign that uniquely holds out Israel for criticism. Of course, there are multiple reasons to be critical of some of the decisions that the Israeli government has made, but this specific campaign is inflected with a particular degree of vehemence towards the State of Israel, the world's only Jewish state, and therefore what we need to do whenever we encounter a political campaign that makes anti-Semitism more of a threat to Jewish people in this country is we need to take action.
Your position as a Conservative MP on this issue has received criticism from some of your colleagues in the House, certainly. How do you deal with this issue within your own party?
I just try to take my colleagues back to what I see as fundamental conservative values. And there is I'm afraid, the ignorance of the reality of the situation in Israel and Palestine and the Levant generally is concerning, and it's very, very one-sided. And and I grew up with it as well. I'm born in 1960, and the vision of poor little Israel, assailed on all sides by Arab nations who were not democracies, of a Six-Day War in 1967, I suppose, is vaguely in my memory, but the Yom Kippur War certainly is, and of course in the run into that were all the aircraft hijackings and the attacks at the Munich Olympics, and it's seeing those things without actually understanding the context out of where did that Palestinian terrorist action in the proper meaning of the word, because that was what it was designed to deliver. Where did that spring from? And there you see an example of like overreach in resistance, because by behaving illegally in those ways, then a disproportionate response has then been received by the Palestinians, but it's gone on and on and on. And there is a historic unfairness here that has to be addressed if we are going to get a settlement. And at some point, Israel and the Palestinians are going to have to come to terms if Israel is to have security and the Palestinians are to get justice.
And when you have conversations like that with people within your own party, your colleagues, do you find that they're receptive to that context?
Depends how deep their commitment is generally and how open they are to conversations. But it's quite difficult to, I believe, to avoid you can't avoid the basic history. If you don't understand it, you've got a duty to understand it. But we're combating a fairly standard British perspective about the conflict, about and all the rhetoric of Israel as a democracy, and obviously with a active and successful Jewish community here, who with one of its major newspapers, his editorial line is "We support Israel, right or wrong." And that's the other half of the community has a different view and is sometimes appalled by what it means for people's regards for the Jewish community and its and the religion itself. If Israel, as the world's only Jewish state, is demonstrating values that fall short, and I think we've just got to just patiently dial this back to what is undoubtedly the right ground for the Palestinians to be seeking justice on, which is the legal and moral authority of their position.
When it comes to this bill and the support for it or lack thereof within the Conservative Party, there's been a lot of reports that that there's a lot of MPs that are threatening to break ranks, and in some reports up to 50 Conservative MPs that are trying to put an end to this bill. This seems like it's causing a little bit of chaos within the Conservative Party. There's a lot of people.
Well, you reap what you sow, and if you propose a measure of this extremity in terms of its implications, and you do it by stealth, and you don't have the conversations beforehand to deal with the likely reaction, as people then realise what they've been presented with and what they've been gulled into supporting, they're likely to get pretty upset.
Do people in the party feel blindsided by this bill?
Yes.
And what then? I mean, what do you see happening?
Frankly, we don't expect our leadership to present us with something that, when on close examination, turns out to have extremely controversial elements associated with it, without these things having been worked through beforehand. Because there will be Conservatives, if they were facing interviews like this now, without a background understanding of the issue, who will then be asked some pretty basic questions about our attachment to freedom of speech.
And there are concerns about wider ramifications of this bill. The government says that it will make exceptions when it comes to Russia and Belarus, for example, but then there are others that are concerned about Uyghurs and their attempts to...
Well, exactly. So, and the way the bill is constructed, with it not being possible for the government to authorise public bodies to have sanctions against any state in the world, except Israel, the occupied territories, and the occupied Golan Heights, which is on the face of the bill. So that will be part of the act. So no future minister will be able to lay an order saying public authorities are authorised to make sanctions and disinvestment decisions and boycott decisions on Israel, its territories, its occupied territories, and the Golan Heights.
And so this is, what is stopping the government, if this bill passes then, from using this in the future when it comes to its trade relations with China or other countries?
Well, it also, the other objectionable part of this is it makes British sanctions policy much more complex, because you've then got to lay an order to allow public bodies to take sanctions against China. Well, how do you lay that order? The future relations with China are incredibly complex and balanced, where you were seeking to have China continue as a partner in managing the global order, to continue to have China as an important trade partner in the mutual benefit of China and the West. And over the last decade, as President Xi's policy appears to become clearer, that China doesn't seem to want to be part of the global order in the way that we would have all hoped 10 years ago. And partnership with China now seems much, much more problematic. Well, that means you do need a certain subtlety and gradation in your relations with China to start to make clear that if they are not prepared to engage in a partnership with the other leading nations in the world about how we're to police global stability, and that there isn't going to be a unipolar world with one nation in effective charge, and that nation being China, we're not going to accept that. Not least with the with obviously an inevitably highly controversial set of values that China has as a communist state. We've taken steps now to defend our critical national infrastructure. Investment is going into that, as well as into ending cooperations with Chinese tech companies and the rest. And you're seeing a progressive shift in United Kingdom policy. Well, sanctions is part of the tool set that are short of conflict that exists for the United Kingdom and the rest of the West to get its point of view across and impose a price if China is not prepared to properly engage in partnership with other nations of the world.
Would you like to see sanctions of this nature extended to countries like Israel?
Well, the idea that a country that is in gross violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention in terms of its occupation and settlement of territories that the whole of the world don't believe belong to it, that nation should be the only one, and those territories, that will be permanently exempt from being on the wrong end of boycott, sanctions and disinvestment decisions by public authorities in the UK, is in those terms pretty extraordinary.
When it comes to BDS activists, when it comes to pro-Palestinian voices attempting to make an argument for economic isolation of the Israeli government, the accusation tends to, generally fall on them that this is anti-Semitic. This is something that isolates Israel, specifically treats it in a unique way. And again, this bill seems to attempt to try and make a similar argument that the targeting of Israel, the targeting of Israeli economic goods or companies is in its essence anti-Semitic. Where do you stand on this idea? Where is the line for you between criticism of Israel, legitimate criticism of Israel, and anti-Semitism?
Well, the charge of anti-Semitism, if you have the presumption to criticize Israel, has been the number one tool in the toolbox for defenders of Israel to deploy, to question the motives of those people who are making those criticisms of the state of Israel. And that has made it within UK politics, because quite rightly we've seen within certainly the lifetime of my parents the appalling consequences in the greatest crime in human history, in terms of the 6 million people perishing in the Holocaust, and the visits that people have quite rightly taken on to go and see what happened at Auschwitz, which is the greatest, perhaps, single crime scene in the world in human history. That, of course, that is quite rightly stamped on people. This is what happens when you allow hatred of people for who they are. This is where it ends. And it's when that is then misused, particularly when in the hands of people who are being pretty ruthless about their objective. In the end, it will catch up with them in the wrong way, and that will be a tragedy.
Will you and others in the Conservative Party continue to fight this bill?
Yes. It's not what I stand for.
Crispin Blunt, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for watching this episode of The Big Picture. Please share your thoughts with us below on what you think of this bill and what it could mean if it passes here in the UK. As always, you can watch or listen to all of our podcasts here or wherever you get your podcasts from. Please follow, please like and subscribe, and until next time, salam.